Hi, everyone. So, quick question. Did anyone do the homework that I asked you to do? Like, raise your hand if you did your homework. Okay, good. It's like one person. Two people, great. So, whoever that asks the best question later will get one of the book that I've written. So, pay attention. Today we're going to talk about the p2e economics. And, p2e, or the metaverse, is a brand new way of organizing and coordinating between different agents in the space. So how do we go about doing this? It's not as simple as just defining your token distribution, your token inflation rate, and you're done. No, it's actually a lot more to consider at the back. So that's what I want to talk to you about. So for context, why are we here? Economics is the most important aspect to get right in your economy, be it a DeFi economy, P2E, or even a country. It's the backbone of the entire market, but it's very, very complicated to get right. So we wrote a very big research on figuring out how to even get started with this. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but at least this is a great starting point to define the parameters to understand what you need to consider when building your system. So we're going to talk about three things today. Why do markets exist? Talking about the framework, and then we're going to apply it to Axie Infinity, giving you the context of how do you use that, and so you can use it in your economy. So this is a very heavy topic, I'm not going to lie, and the slides here are going to be a bit more simplified. So if you go to ethdenver.com and you go to the schedule, that is a much more in-depth with a lot more information. So I can talk quite fast, so better to follow the slides. Okay, so why do markets exist? Markets exist for the sole reason: it provides value. And it provides value by reducing transaction cost. But what do we mean by that? Firstly, value is created when matching is done right. So a market exists because you have different kind of economic agents coming together to trade. Otherwise, you can just go out and do OTC, right? So your market is very valuable when you can match the right kind of people, the right kind of transactions to trade. The second thing is, when is value realized? Value is realized when you reduce the cost, you reduce the transaction cost of searching. This means making it more efficient in terms of time, energy, and effort to match with someone. And so if a market can create that kind of environment to match with the right person and reduce the cost of searching the person to match with, that creates a lot of value in terms of opportunity cost. And lastly, how is value retained? This is going to be very important because a market allows people to interact, it allows people to transact, and more importantly, you need to define the rules in which transaction exists, in which transaction can be executed. And this is very important, and we see this in both the developing world and the developed world. In the developed world, we have a lot of regulations in place, and we have a lot of contracts in place because people follow contracts. In developing worlds, that can be a little bit more difficult sometimes. And if you compare these two economies, not that it's 100% correlated, but there is a bigger growth in GDP for developed worlds. So let's move to the next part on understanding the framework. The entire report and the YouTube video also share a little bit more about how do we understand the framework, how do we define the framework, and how can we use the framework to be useful in the report or in the project that you're working on. This is really a starting point to design your economy. With every framework that we do, we always follow three core design pillars: market design, mechanism design, and token design. In market design, it is defining the parameters of your world, of the different constraints, the different kind of economic agents, transaction pathways, different kind of activities we want to create. So these are constraints in the space, defining the market. Then we go on to mechanism design. Mechanism design defines the different kind of rules in place where people need to follow, and these are the rules that we talk about, where all users, if you want to transact, you want to interact, you have to follow these rules. And these rules can be governed in code, in smart contract, in legal contracts. And lastly, token design. Token design, when we talk about tokens, it's not about just your AXS or SLP or your different kind of tokens you can trade. Token is anything that captures value. Any intrinsic value, extrinsic value. As long as you're capturing value, that can be tokenized, that's a token. A token is anything that represents value. So here we want to understand how do we have these inflationary and deflationary pressures to govern these assets, to govern this token that represents value, to maintain a very robust system. We're going to dive a lot more into that later. Usually we typically think about it as monetary policy, but it goes a lot more beyond that. You can look at token as money, but some of the tokens they have more functions than just money. So we did this in DeFi, where we talk about market design, mechanism design, token design. In the metaverse, p2e as well, just that the different criteria within the framework, within the pillars, is quite different. So in the p2e economics model and the economics framework, what do we look at? When we look at market design, we look at user-generated content, NFTs and in-game usability, and value creation. In mechanism design, we look at the governance model, the revenue model, network effects. And in token design, we look at monetary policy. I'm going to dive deeper into value creation because I think that is very important, and that's something that you want to get right so that everything else can come into play. So when we talk about value creation, we talk about three aspects of value creation. The first, the value creation cycle looks at the value cycle in general. It looks at value creation, value distribution, and value sinks. So the best analogy that I'll use is pie. So value creation is growing the pie. Value distribution is splitting the pie, and value sinks is consuming the pie. A lot of projects focus a lot on value distribution and value creation, which is very important because, as I said, a market exists because it creates value. So you want to get your users, you want to get your economic agents to focus very much on value creation, and then you distribute this value out. That's how we have a robust growth. But one of the biggest problems is that people forget about value sinks. Value sinks is to reduce the circulating assets in the space to increase, which is the nominal asset that we call, to increase the real value. So in all the inflationary aspects aside, what is the real value that can be accrued to the user, which is eating the pie. So the value creation can be represented in a lot of different mechanisms. And one of the easiest mechanisms that we can look at is the monetary policy. We'll dive deeper into that monetary policy with Axie as an example. And just understanding how this thing works, we talk about it in our report. And so we're going to use Axie as an example to understand how the economics work. What are the various key components that you can grow the pie, slice the pie, and consume the pie. And now let's get started with Axie. Anyone here does not know what Axie is? Raise your hand. All right, okay, some people don't know Axie. Very, very good. So to give you some context, Axie is it's a very popular game, and it's an NFT game. So it's people having these NFTs called Axies, A-X-I-E, and so you can breed them, you can trade them, you can sell them. So it was kind of like Pokemon Go, where you have to trade with people, you have to battle with people. And anyone can come in to play the game. You need to buy your little Axies to be able to go into battles. At the same time, you can do a lot of different activities in the space to earn different kind of points. You've got a token called SLP to earn your different points. You have a token called AXS, which is kind of like a governance function. And then you have your Axie, which is your NFT. So these are the three core components and three core resources that we have. So before we get started, to even decide what the economy is, what are the different areas in the economy, or how do we even design the economy, the first thing we need to understand is how do we even define the market? And when we look at defining the market, we look at who are the different participants in the space, who are the different kind of personas. And the 5 key personas we look at for any NFTs or any metaverse games is players, builders, developers, investors, and NFT collectors. The important thing of figuring out these personas is not just to know that they exist. We want to understand from these personas what kind of value can they create, what kind of economic value can they create. Then what are their incentives? What incentives do we need to drive them? And what are the tools and resources we have within the economy to get that done? At the end of the day, economics is really an incentive driver. So how do we understand what are the various incentives we need to think about, we need to balance? Because, for example, one of the personas is really at optimizing your ROI. Another one might be optimizing gameplay. So there are a lot of these different kind of incentives based on the different personas in the space. Your economic policies, your economic mechanism is about balancing all these different kind of forces. So taking a look at Axie, the first one is players. Players, you have these people who are who are scholars, as they call it, to play the game. Because these Axies to go for battles are very expensive, and they can't afford it sometimes because it's just really expensive. So they will get a scholarship to be able to rent, kind of like renting these Axies to play. This makes up 65% of the user base, which is quite significant, which is good because when we're talking about games, we're talking about these kind of games, we want more players to be in the space, to be using and creating value. Think of the players a bit like middle class. You need the middle class to be working, you need the middle class to be creating value for the entire economy to grow. Then we've got builders. Typically builders, we look at people who are, when we talk about UGC, user-generated content, these people are creating content to make the game more complex, to make the game a bit more like a metaverse, a universe that everyone can come in together, contribute, and grow. So here, they just roll out this thing called Project K, which is building lands in Axie Infinity, and you have a limited supply of land. You have 90,000 plots of land, and the land cost 2.3 million US dollars each. So clearly, this is something that it's not free for all. It creates a kind of monopolistic class of people who can own these land. And we can talk about little problems with that later, but this is how asset will be distributed. And builders come in to buy land and build different kind of gameplay within each land that they own. The third category of the personas is the developers. Typically, these developers are centralized leadership team to keep the core team to keep this entire gameplay making sense and this entire gameplay to be fun. Initially, usually this is centralized and slowly it will start to decentralize. The fourth category is investors or sponsors in Axie's game. So 2.3 million people own Axie, and these people will lend the Axie out for the players, which is the scholarship program, to be using the Axie to play. And lastly, which is something that we don't really see in traditional games, more in this metaverse game, are collectors, NFT collectors. So these are NFT, and in the Axie game is the Axie collectors. These are these little creatures that they create. And currently the market value of all of the Axies combined is $47 million. So given that we understand a little bit more about the market, how do we put that into context of this framework that we've created? We've got market design, mechanism design, token design. Market design is understanding the various aspects, the various parameters in this thing that defines what the market is. In mechanism design, we're figuring out the rules of the game, the ways that they can interact, the ways to define the transactional pathways between these different kind of personas or economic agents. But what I want to focus here is on token design. Again, people think of tokens as in the SLP or AXS in this entire space. But if you look closely at what are the different ways that we can generate value within this system, we have 5 different classes of tokens, anything that represents value. First one, of course, is the Axies, is the NFTs. And here, we can look at some understanding of what are the constraints and considerations when understanding the monetary policy of Axies. There needs to be a minimum 3x of the user base. Every individual needs to have at least 3 Axies to be playing the game. So that means there's a bottom floor, a number floor of the number of Axies that exist. It's 3 times the user base. So the faster the user base grows, the faster the Axie grows as well. Breeding of these Axies is inflation. And for every Axie, you can breed 7 times. You can have babies 7 times, 7 generations, before the Axie just can't reproduce anymore. And so this helps with inflation management in the entire space. The second thing is SLP. SLP is the uncapped token. It's the general token. It's like a little point system to incentivize people to do different kind of tasks. The 2 main tasks in this game. The first one is just understanding gameplay, and the second is to just get user retention and get them to be on the game more often. And SLP is the incentive. Again, economics is all about incentive. It's the incentive to get people to achieve these 2 different kind of core economic activity, economic value creation. The third one is AXS. So AXS is a governance token. It's fixed in supply. And right now, the current utility is to stake to earn more AXS and also to breed Axies. Then the fourth category, we have energy and EXP. So energy and EXP is the experience points for your Axie little creatures. And these 2 are these key parameters that we can tweak and change to affect the inflation rate of SLP. Remember, SLP is the daily inflation based on the different tasks. So these tasks are not just fixed. You have different parameters that we can tweak to increase or decrease the inflation rate of SLP. And we can do that with these 2 other variables called energy and EXP. And lastly, we've got land, which is Project K that we talked about. This is something that they just released, and they're looking to improve this land aspect as time goes. So what does that look like? How does the economy come together, and how does that make sense? Internally, Axie, what we want to focus on, or what Axie needs to focus on, is to balance between user growth and inflationary asset pressures. User growth is new users coming in, the core base users, the bottom of the pyramid coming in to play the game, to understand the game before they level up with experience points. And with every user that comes in, you have inflationary pressures of SLP, which is the main incentive driver. Anyone who does any activities, anyone who does PvE, so player versus environment or player versus player game, you just collect SLP. So the more people come in, there is an exponential effect on the inflation of the SLP asset. So what Axie needs to do is to figure out how do you balance both. If one grows too fast without the other, then you have a lot of problems. So just like how the government works, you need to balance between all these different pressures. So that's internally. But the thing is, And this is something that, traditional games you have to think about anyway. What about externally? This is the key difference between traditional games and metaverse games. Externally, you have to think about the exchange rate. This is just like, foreign exchange if you work in the traditional finance space. And externally, you have to understand the exchange rate between your asset and whatever asset is in your treasury becomes a very important consideration for how people will remain sticky in your ecosystem. Axie is an importer of ETH. So to buy any of these Axies and Infinity and these games and be part of the games, you need to pay in ETH. And so Axie is an importer of ETH. And as SLP prices increase or decrease, it really affects the exchange rate. And this will affect people's willingness to play and stay in the game. Especially we talked about how 65% of people do not own any Axies. They're just regular game players. They come and they borrow the Axies and they play. So understanding their incentive to balance between getting them to play, getting them on board, getting them to be sticky in your ecosystem to continuously play, you need to balance between the inflation rate of this foreign exchange, which is your SLP versus ETH or AXS versus ETH. So how does that look like in the value creation cycle? Value creation, when we talk about value creation, we have to look at skills versus participation consideration. This specifically is PvE and PvP gameplay. PvP is player versus player, PvE is player versus environment. So player versus environment is you just get the player to go and do different kind of things and you get points. Just like, imagine just asking them to go and play Wordle every single day and you get SLP. So that kind of concept. It's just about participation. The goal of this is to try to make things a bit sticky for people to keep coming back to the game. That being said, if they don't stick and you just keep giving free rewards out, that's not going to be sustainable. The other thing that would be a lot better is to use skills as a consideration to incentivize more activities in the space, which is PvP. So computers are not part of this. Computers are just a way to allow people to transact and meet and match. And this is where player versus player come together and combat in the skill sets. When we talk about value distribution, we look at the various kind of assets and understanding that the user growth affects the SLP inflation as well as the Axie breeding rates. So again, the SLP inflation is dependent on users coming in and playing together and playing with the environment and increasing in supply. So that one we understand. What about Axie breeding? Again, you bring two Axies together and Axies get to breed. They get to breed up to 7 times. And this is something important to consider because the rate of your Axie inflation is dependent on how quickly the user base is growing, how quickly the marketplace is trading, how rare these assets are, how much people want to collect, and all these other considerations coming together. And so at the end of the day, SLP inflation and Axie breeding are all predominantly focused on increasing user growth in the Axie's ecosystem. And that means if Axie stops growing in user base, the system doesn't work. And this is going to be one of the problems that we'll see. The other aspects that we need to talk about is value sinks. Typically in value sink or any sink pool that we think about is reducing the supply. Here, that is the concept, but what is the end goal? So there's a nominal increase. So nominal increase is just a number increase in your asset. The real value is where you divide by all these inflationary pressures to get the real value in USD. So what we want to do is to make sure that there is this balance so that the real value of every player increases. Right now we see that SLP just keeps inflating because new players are coming in and all these different things they've talked about. And that's great. You have more SLPs to play around with. But if SLP is actually devaluing because of the foreign exchange rate we talked about, each SLP is worth less, then you can increase the number of SLPs as you want, but the total monetary value actually decreases. So the way we do this is to enforce a little bit more deflationary pressures. This could be increasing utility, this could be burning these tokens, and try to balance between these inflationary and deflationary pressures to really increase real value to users. And why do we need to do that? Why is that important? If you abstract that out, we look at this value, this is a triangle, and we want to figure out how do we get X to the middle. That's where your ecosystem is robust, your ecosystem is sustainable to continuously do value creation, value growth. But right now, the X is quite skewed towards your short-term growth, which is a value distribution. So in value distribution, here, this is what Axie has been doing for a very, very long time and very well. The first one is to increase your DAU. So they have a lot of people playing, and CNN did a big report about it. There was a huge growth in the user base. They also moved to Ronin, which is a sidechain on Ethereum, and it's a lot cheaper, so it's a lot easier for people to come in and play. So there's an increase in DAU, which is great. And this is something that's important when you're starting your ecosystem, you just need more people coming in. The second thing is they're trying to manage your daily SLP minting. And initially, it was in crazy amount, a lot, and now, and with every community call, every month they do a report saying they're trying to manage your SLP minting. You don't want it to mint so fast. You don't want to increase your SLP so much because it creates a lot of different kind of inflationary pressures. And lastly, they have been doing quite a good job in reducing botting and loopholes. So this is great. This helps with managing your value distribution in the short run. However, Axie is also now moving towards a long-run growth. Axie is now moving to another stage in its economy where it needs to focus on long-run growth, focus on value creation. And here, they need to start looking at increasing the usability of SLP. They need to, otherwise it will just be selling pressure, and it will just be people selling. The way of using SLP right now is mainly to breed Axies. When you breed Axies, then you need to burn your SLP, and this is the deflationary pressures. But there are like 3 different factors of increasing SLP and 1 factor to decrease SLP. Also, we talked about breeding just now. Breeding is contingent on user-based growth. The user-based growth has slowed down quite a bit, so it reduces the probability of someone wanting to breed, which reduces the probability of SLPs being used and being used in the system. So there's a lot of pressures in this space. And let's talk a little bit about value sinks, because this is very important in terms of getting the actual users to come in and play. This is like the middle class. We need to balance all these different forces to make sure that the middle class continues to grow and make the game a bit more fun. So in general, the problem sounds like this is a Ponzi scam because we just need more and more people coming in, and it's a bit unsustainable. The good news is that this is a natural part of your entire cycle anyway. So you want to now that they have a good amount of people, how do you move towards long-term value creation, and what are the various tools that they have today that focus on retention of users and growth of the ecosystem? So there's some parameters to tune. I just want to conclude with that. The first one is SLP. They can tune SLP, they can tune Axie, and they can tune AXS. So for SLP, these are different parameters that you can just think of it as you're flying a plane, and these are the different buttons to press. The first one is affecting energy for SLP, affecting EXP for Axie, and also for the daily quest of SLP, it's focusing a lot more on skills incentive than participation incentive. To just give you a general amount of chart, that the SLP growth is growing exponentially fast. The rate of burn versus SLP supply inflation is just not balanced, and you have a huge supply growth, which typically is fine, it's fine of that growth because that's just normal. However, you want to balance it with the amount of active daily players and active user growth. And the active user growth needs to be quite aligned, needs to be balanced, and these are the parameters you need to tweak so that it's aligned. And the good thing about blockchain is that we have a lot more information to figure out what are the proxies to understand whether our measures in place is safe or not. The other thing is Axie, so we can affect the breeding rate, the Axie supply, and the MMR matching, which is, remember we talked about how markets exist because they matches people, so getting better at all these matching mechanisms. And lastly, AXS usage. So with AXS usage is to increase usage of AXS. TLDR. So TLDR, there's no equilibrium. Economics is about this internal regulation mechanism. We need to balance between resources and value creation. You need to grow them proportionally. Where one grows too fast, you need to slow that growth down and you grow the other part together. That's how you can grow the pie, split the pie, and consume the pie. And quick conclusion, this is what we do at Economics Design. We design and measure economic policies for DeFi and Metaverse. And I run this company, and it's been wonderful with all the brilliant people that I have. The ultimate goal is to define gross protocol value. Market cap, TVL, FDV, these are not good enough because these do not capture the value that protocols can bring. And the long-term goal is to figure out how do we define GPV, and also figuring out how can we design new mechanisms in non-Euclidean spaces. I talk about the report very often. Scan the QR code, you can get the report. It's about a 70-page report. Happy reading. Thank you. We don't have time for questions.